This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Rory Kennedy is a preeminent documentary filmmaker, and she's on this edition of Conversations. She comes from one of America's most prominent political families. But the youngest child of Bobby and Ethel Kennedy has made her mark away from the family business of politics. Rory Kennedy is an award-winning director and producer. Her documentaries have explored compelling and sometimes controversial topics. From poverty and AIDS to Abu Ghraib, her films have examined issues that have global consequences. Rory Kennedy's documentaries have also explored transformative personalities like chess champion Bobby Fischer, longtime White House correspondent Helen Thomas, and her own mother, Ethel Kennedy. The film Ethel was nominated for 5 Emmy Awards. Her latest endeavor is the Academy Award-nominated Last Days in Vietnam, which is a highly emotional and raw look at the final days leading to the fall of Saigon. We are glad to have Rory Kennedy on this edition of Conversations. Thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here, Jeff.
Why make the film about the last days in Vietnam?
Well, I was approached by Mark Samuels, who's at American Experience on PBS, and he asked if I would be interested in doing a documentary about the final days of the war. I was very interested. I have always been fascinated with Vietnam from a very young age. My father, Robert Kennedy, jumped into that final campaign in 1968 really because he felt so passionately that we get out of Vietnam. So I had an appreciation for the war, for all the lessons that we could learn from it. My reservation about doing the film was that I felt that there had been so much done about Vietnam, and would I be able to add anything new? But as I delved into the research, I realized that this is an extraordinary story that really hasn't been told. And now, having shared the film with people, it's had a nice, robust theatrical release over the last year. And I would say the dominant response from audiences is, I thought I knew this story and I don't know this story. And you know, I think that the other thing that really attracted me to it is this film is really about the final days of the war, and as we're struggling still to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan, I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from looking back, even though these events took place 40 years ago. They're still extraordinarily relevant today.
As you were doing your research, what surprised you most? What did you learn that you didn't know?
Well, the story, part of what excited me about this was uncovering these stories that I certainly didn't know of Americans who were on the ground during those final days, who did everything they could to save as many South Vietnamese as possible. I think for so many of us, this association with Vietnam is a sense that this was not a bright, shining moment in American history. And there, you know, there really were no opportunities for heroism in Vietnam, American heroism. But these are stories of Americans who really did everything they could during those final days, and definitely risked their jobs and arguably risked their lives to save as many Vietnamese as possible in some pretty dramatic ways that we, you know, have footage of, that we include in this story. And I think that, you know, for many audiences, the film absolutely takes an unflinching look at American policy in Vietnam, you know, the fact that ultimately we abandoned our allies, we left them there, but that these handful of Americans did everything they could. And I think in that sense, many people feel proud of these Americans in watching the film. And there's, you know, it wasn't the story I intended to tell, but it was such an extraordinary story, and it really did speak to what happened during those final days. And it's really actually been a great honor for me to have told it and to be able to share it with audiences.
What sort of response have you received from veterans?
It's been really positive. I mean, I would say the Vietnamese community and the veterans have been our kind of most loyal audience throughout this whole thing, and it's been great having the film on PBS and the extensive outreach efforts that we engaged in with PBS, leading that effort and really partnering with veteran communities and veterans organizations, and they certainly have come to these theaters, they've supported it, they've been really wonderful partners in making this film, so I'm eternally grateful to them.
What do you think would have happened if Watergate had not come along? Had Richard Nixon remained president, would things have been different?
I think the events would have still unfolded, probably not too unlike they did, but it may have happened a little later. There was a sense, and I didn't know this fact in history, that part of the reason the North had not come in earlier is that they were terrified of Richard Nixon because they thought he was a madman and he would do anything. And so that when Richard Nixon resigned and Watergate happened, he resigned, Ford became the president, they saw an opportunity. And they came in to the northern part of South Vietnam and sort of put feelers out to see what the United States would do. And of course, we didn't respond and we didn't send any military back. This was, just to orient your audience, this was in 1975, 2 years earlier. We had signed the Paris Peace Accord, which was creating a peace agreement between North and South Vietnam, and the hope was that they would coexist. And part of that peace agreement was an understanding that the North and the South wouldn't invade each other. So the North broke the peace treaty. The South had arguably broken it prior to then as well, but in any case, they broke it in a pretty significant way. They came in, and the American troops had left in 1973. So we had no troop military presence. We still had a ambassador there. We had about 6,000 to 7,000 American personnel in country who were helping to keep the peace. But we had no military presence, and so the North came in. America didn't respond, and they thought it would take 2 years to get to Saigon. It took 4 months. Yeah. And because of that, you know, they were really, the Americans were cut off guard, and when, you know, the North gave us 24 hours to get out of Saigon, we were, we had to really just do everything we could to get the Americans out, and that was the focus of American policy. And so these handful of Americans did everything they could in that moment to try to save as many South Vietnamese.
In the film, you talked to Dr. Henry Kissinger. What was that like?
Well, it was interesting. He was probably one of the hardest people to get to agree to be in the film. He said no a lot before he said yes. But eventually he agreed to be in the film, which I was happy about because, you know, he really does help explain what was happening in the field, but then how Washington was responding to that information. And often, which he acknowledges, to misinformation and making decisions based on a misunderstanding. You know, he talks about how the North had come in, they had bombed the airport on April 29th at 3:45 in the morning, and then the North said, you have 24 hours to get out of here. And so then that's when the official evacuation was greenlit by the ambassador, and they could no longer orient the evacuation out of the airport because it had been bombed, which is why we moved to the embassy, right? People are familiar with that helicopter shot, which wasn't even in the embassy, but they think it's in the embassy. But in any case, you know, Kissinger was told, okay, we need to greenlight this, send the helicopters at 11 a.m., and Kissinger was operating on Greenwich Mean Time, and they were operating on Vietnamese time, and so the helicopters came 2 hours later. You know, there were a number of kind of snafus like that happened along the way that, of course, had great consequence, but it's fascinating to hear and to understand what they knew and why they were making the decisions they were making in that moment. And I have to say, you know, he's obviously an extraordinarily controversial figure. I think that he does offer a lot in terms of his voice to this particular moment because of his extraordinary recall. He, I think, was 89 years old when I interviewed him. And he remembered down to the minute what was happening in that 24-hour period. And, you know, when the ambassador drove to the airport, and then when they, you know, greenlit the evacuation out of the embassy, and how the ambassador refused to get on the first helicopter because he was trying to get as many Vietnamese as possible, and how many Vietnamese were in the embassy, and why they calculated the number of helicopters to be this because they were operating on this number, and then they cut it off prematurely. And, you know, of course, 420 Vietnamese were left in the embassy after they had been told they would get out. So his recount was really, I think, offers a lot of insights into this moment. So no matter what you think of Kissinger, I think it's important to understand what happened in this moment in history, and he does deliver on that.
You have in the film some powerful video. I mean, it's very, very compelling. Where did that come from? How were you able to gather all that together?
Well, the archival effort was significant and mammoth, and I really wanted to kind of ground the audience in the real and help transport them to Saigon in April of 1975. So we had a great team who did terrific archival research in, you know, ABC, NBC, CBS archival houses. We found some extraordinary footage that largely has not been seen. Then we got very lucky. We came across some footage in one of the sailors who was on the U.S. Kirk, which played an unexpected but significant role in the evacuation. It turns out that in his attic he came across a box about 4 months prior to me starting this project, a box of Super 8 untransferred footage of these final days. And he didn't know what was in it. I didn't know what was in it. Anyway, I ended up flying him out to Los Angeles, where I was based, and we got the footage transferred, and it was a treasure trove. And so we use, I think, about 12 minutes of his footage in the film, and that's never been seen before, and is really documents some pretty extraordinary moments of courage and bravery, and I think really helps capture this remarkable moment.
One of those moments had to have been what happened with the Chinook helicopter.
Yes.
And the South Vietnamese pilot of the Chinook helicopter and what he did. And we have a piece of that footage, and I'm going to have James play that piece from the movie, and then afterwards we'll get you to comment about it.
Okay, so, maybe could I just take a moment to orient the audience as to what's going on?
Do.
Okay, so the evacuation is happening now from the embassy. There's a fleet of U.S. ships out in the South China Sea. So these helicopters are going from the fleet to the embassy, picking people up from the embassy and bringing them back out to the fleet. There's a ship called the Chinook, called the USS Kirk, which is protecting the fleet, and so it's between the fleet and the shore in case any North Vietnamese come in and try to bomb or attack the fleet. So it's there to monitor. What happens is that as these American helicopters are heading out to the fleet, the South Vietnamese Air Force is disintegrated, but they still have their helicopters and they still have pilots, right? So a number of the South Vietnamese helicopter pilots get into their Huey helicopters and they start filling them with their families and colleagues and start chasing the American helicopters out to sea. Now, they don't know if there's a place to land, how they will be received by the Americans, what's going to happen. They just feel that it is safer to head out to sea.
Going on faith.
Yes, going on faith. I mean, you know, the courage that alone takes is pretty extraordinary. Anyway, so one of the first ships that they often come to is the USS Kirk. And so what had happened is that the USS Kirk had been there and said, well, what do we do? And the captain made the decision, let's bring the first one down. And so they bring them down, and 13 Vietnamese come out of this space that's meant for 4 people. And then they say, well, what do? We don't have room for any more helicopters, because that's not what this ship was meant for. And the captain says, throw those helicopters overboard. Yep. Let's make room for the next one. So they continue to do that throughout the day, and then what happens is this very large Chinook helicopter comes with the family. So now we'll cut to that and see what happens.
Let's play the video.
Okay.
Ship. big Chinook showed up. There's no way he can land on Kirk without impacting the ship. He would have killed everybody on this helicopter plus my crew.
It was way too big to land. We thought that the helicopter would just fly away. But as the ship was moving forward, probably 4, 5, 6 knots, something like that, the pilot communicated that he was running low on fuel.
He opened up the port side of the helicopter and he hovered across the stern of Kirk. Then all of a sudden, here comes a human.
One by one, we jump out. I jumped out, my brother jumped out. My mom was holding my sister. Well, obviously very scared. And she just, just trustingly, just with one hand, with her right hand, holding on with her left to brace herself, just dropped my baby sister.
One fella standing there, and he said he looked up and he saw this big bundle of stuff come flying out, and it was a baby. It was the 1-year-old baby. And then the mother jumped out and he caught her too. Then the pilot flew out on our starboard right side. He hovered with his wheels in and out of the water. He hovered there for like 10 minutes. And we couldn't figure out what he was doing. It turned out what he was doing was taking his flight suit off. Here's a man flying a twin-rotor helicopter by himself. At the same time, he's taking off a flight suit. How you do it, I've talked to helicopter pilots, and they can't figure out how he did that. How like a Houdini trying to get out of this thing. And finally, he made the helicopter roll to the right as he stepped out the door on the left.
Just thunderous, loud noise. The shrapnel is just blowing up. Suddenly, just quiet. And he pops up, and he's alive.
And he swam away.
What an amazing story.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. It really is.
Speaking of courage and guts and wanting to save your family.
Yeah, I mean,
Phenomenal.
Can you imagine throwing your 8-month-old baby out of a helicopter onto a moving ship? And they caught each one of those children, and I think the worst that happened was somebody had a broken ankle.
Wow.
But it's an amazing thing.
Phenomenal.
And there's so many stories like this in this film that I think very few of us know and have heard about, and so it's been really fun to be able to share it, and
it's enlightening,
I think
for sure.
Important.
Absolutely. Let's talk about some of your other films, and the one I want to kind of concentrate on in particular. You made a film about your mom, Ethel.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, I was approached by HBO. I've done a number of documentaries with HBO, and Sheila Nevins, who runs their documentary department, she had met my mother a number of times over the course of me making films with them and at various screenings and whatnot, and she was very determined to have me make a film about my mother. I was reticent to do it. And I think in large part because it's because of my mother and how, we grew up and how we were so focused on looking out for other people. We were not in a culture where you spent a lot of time thinking about yourself. Yeah. It was a lot of time thinking about other people and how you can help other people, which I think is great and enormously valuable. So the idea of doing something about my mother or about my family when there were so many other pressing issues was just not something that that I felt like I really, really wanted to do, however much I admire my mother and feel like her story is deserving. So I kept saying no, she kept saying yes, and then I said, fine, we'll ask my mother, because I knew my mother would say no. And then I called my mother and I said, I'm sure you don't want to do this, but will you, HBO would like us to do a film about you. And she said yes, and I was shocked. I was shocked. I thought I knew my mother. Clearly I didn't. I asked her later why she said yes, and she said, because you asked me. Of course I'm going to do anything you ask me. Like, anyway.
I want to play the trailer of Ethel so our audience can sort of understand the essence of the film. So let's play the trailer of Ethel.
Okay.
Why should I have to answer all these questions?
Well, we're making a documentary about you. Because I was born 6 months after my father's death, I never had a chance to know him. I was raised by my mother, Ethel Kennedy. So was it love at first sight?
It was.
Really?
Wow. My parents weren't bedrock Democrats, but I just totally put the Republican part behind me. The children were always included in everything we did. They could probably made them more interesting.
Any occasion that there was to have a party, there'd be a party.
She had every single member of President Kennedy's cabinet knocked into the swimming pool.
Win. That was important. Trying hard, not part of the culture.
Losing isn't any fun, no kidding.
Especially after Daddy died, we learned sports from Mommy.
While the rest of the world was grieving and the family was grieving, she saw the best in it.
Nobody gets a free ride. Everybody faces friends who have died or family.
What do you attribute your success to? I think just the effort that we made in the campaign. And Ethel.
What do you most admire about your mom?
You know, my mother loves people, and I think that that comes through in every facet of her life. And I think that she has an enormous heart, an enormous sense of compassion. And I think, you know, she's really committed herself to helping others. And I have huge admiration for her for that.
She must be a tremendously strong woman too, because I mean, she had to go through so much.
She's tough. She's tough, and she's, you know, she's also just warm and funny and spirited, and she's got a lot of really pretty exceptional character traits that stand out.
When the film was finished, what did she say about it?
Well, her initial response was, you know, I think she was very self-conscious in watching it. And so I think it was, I think for many people, if they, you know, when you see yourself on film, you're used to watching yourself on film. But I think for people, you know, you just look at yourself and think, oh my God, what was I wearing? And look at that hairdo, and how could I say something like that? But I think over time, you know, the film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, and there was an audience of 700 or 800 people, and they gave her a standing ovation. And I think since then it's been on HBO and you know, out and about in the world, and there's been a really positive response to it. So I think that she's come to appreciate it and appreciate kind of what it says about her, and been able to look at it with a little bit more distance.
Ask you a question. This is somewhat personal. I'm just curious. Have you ever thought how the world or how history might be different had your uncle and your father lived?
You know, I don't really dwell on that myself. I think that it's impossible to know, and it's not. You know, I think that it's worthy to kind of look at the contributions that they made while they were alive, and I think there's a lot to learn from what their priorities were and how they live their lives, and I have huge admiration, respect, and I think they made enormous contributions. You know, the kind of what ifs is, I don't know where it gets us.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Just curious. Yeah, interesting. What's next for you? Any more films in the near future?
You know, I love making documentaries, and I'm committed to continue to make them. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do next. This film, Last Days in Vietnam, just came out on PBS a few weeks ago, and is still on pbs.org for those of you interested in watching the whole thing. So that's just finished, and I've got 3 young children, so I'm happy to be spending a little time with them before jumping into the next project.
Would we ever see Rory Kennedy in politics? elected office?
You know, I have no plans to pursue elected office. You know, hopefully life is long, and so I wouldn't say definitively no, but I really love making films, and I feel like they make a significant contribution, and I think they make a big, you know, can make a difference in the world, along with, you know, wonderful politicians who are, you know, changing the course of our nation and sort of where we're heading, and it can really contribute in their own ways. So I think that we need all these facets, and it's, you know, making these films is a small piece of the pie, but I think it's a piece of the pie, and I love doing it, so I'm going to stick with that for the time being.
Are there, and I've only got just a couple of minutes, any particular areas when it comes to making films that you want to focus on maybe moving forward? I mean, is there something that really excites you?
You know, my brother Chris says I make two types of films, depressing and really depressing. So it may be within that range, the next project. You know, I mean, I think if I look back at the films that I've made over the years, you know, it ranges from, as you say, Abu Ghraib to AIDS to Helen Thomas. And I think that to me, it's kind of, I really enjoy the process of looking at kind of complex social issues and telling them through the perspective of individuals and what their experience is. And I think that we can learn a lot about these issues by kind of getting into the personal. Just like with Vietnam, you know, this is very much a story about these individuals and what happened to them during this time. And I think in that we have insight into a much larger, complex moment. So I think that's kind of my style and what I'll continue to pursue.
Rory Kennedy, thank you so very much. What a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you, Jeff. Thank you.
You as well. Best of luck to you.
Thanks.
The film is an Academy Award-nominated documentary, The Last Days in Vietnam. By the way, you can learn more about Rory and her films at moxiefirecracker.com. You can also see more of our conversations online at WSRE.org/conversations, as well as on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the broadcast. Take great care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.